Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Jenkins Nanovic. And I just wanted to not take up too much of our guest speakers' time today, but I did want to introduce her briefly. So we're really honored to have Rithika Kumar speak today. She is quite widely educated, not just in one field, but in multiple fields. So she has degrees in economics as well as in political science. Her undergraduate degree was from St. Xavier's in Mumbai. She also did a master's at Mumbai University and then a PhD focusing on comparative politics at University of Pennsylvania. What the research she's presenting today is related to her dissertation project, and she just completed that last year. She's here as a Kellogg Fellow all year, and you can come visit her in Kellogg if you have any questions about her work. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rithika and take it away.
Thank you, Lynn. I think I have to turn it on. Yeah, okay, awesome. Thanks everyone, and thanks for joining today. And thanks for the kind introduction. I'm excited to present my dissertation research, which is also now a book project. So with that, let's move ahead. Internal migration, which is migration that occurs, within national borders or within a region, is a significant demographic phenomenon across the global south. And according to some estimates, about 10% of the global population consists of this form of internal migrants. And the international migration, like the magnitude, really pales in comparison to internal migration. And this form of migration, which is migration within national borders, is dominated by migration for economic reasons or economic opportunities. And one of the key features of this form of economic internal migration is that firstly, it's temporary in nature, right? And another key feature is that it's heavily dominated by men. So it's a male-dominated phenomenon, that is internal economic migration. And what this effectively implies is that you have men who are migrant men leaving behind their wives and families for a prolonged period of time. And just given the sheer magnitude of this phenomenon, sometimes in some communities, it's equivalent to them just being emptied out of able-bodied male members within the community. And this was precisely what I observed when I was doing my fieldwork in a migrant-sending community in India. And I saw the striking presence of women in the public sphere. So I saw women taking public transportation. Women taking public transportation, trying to get from their village to the district town. I saw them at government offices. I saw them talking to street-level bureaucrats. I saw them talking to elected representatives, asking for their rights and demanding services from them, right? And why is this particularly striking? So this was particularly striking for two reasons. So one of the reasons why this was striking is because the public sphere in these communities, like in India, which is highly patriarchal, is dominated by men. So in the community that I was in, even something like doing grocery shopping is considered to be a male domain. And women in the Indian context have been dropping out of the labor force. So we've actually been seeing a decline in labor force participation among women. And the other reason why this is particularly striking is because we've seen that there is persistent gender gaps in different forms of political participation. And I mean, this is across the globe. And even in India, we see that women make up only 14% of elected representatives in the national level parliament. So that's the highest form of participation and empowerment. And women consistently lag behind men in key forms of non-electoral forms of participation. So, which is precisely what I was talking to you about, going and talking to elected representatives, asking for your rights, asking for services, so or attending rallies and meetings. So you see that women consistently lag behind men, which is why seeing women in these migrant sending communities doing these things was particularly striking. And upon talking to a lot of these women, I realized that, many of them had migrant husbands, and they were stepping into these roles in the public sphere, in the political sphere, in the absence of their husbands. So all of these observations kind of brought me to the main question that's underpinning my project, which is, how does male migration affect women's political lives in migrant-sending communities? And today, I'm going to make an argument that suggests that male migration creates the temporary absence of men from women's lives, which eases certain norm-driven restrictions and brings about women's political empowerment, particularly by thrusting them into the social sphere or the public sphere, right? It's a lot of concepts, and I'm going to kind of unpack each of these as we go ahead. So this quote is from one of my respondents, and I think it really summarizes the essence of the project and what I'm trying to say. So this is a woman with a migrant husband in a village in India where I do my fieldwork. And she says, I was returning home the other day after grocery shopping, and I saw a road being built in the other neighborhood within the village. And then she paused and looks at me, and then she says, when you came here to meet me, you saw that the approach to my house is a mess. So I raised this with my local elected representative, since my own village has poor connectivity and we deserve better roads, right? So you have here a woman with a migrant husband who is doing something like grocery shopping, and while doing that is gathering information that she is then utilizing to go and contact her elected representative to demand for better roads, right? So that's kind of the whole crux of what I'm trying to say with this project. So I'm going to first present to you a theory that sits at the intersection of two important bodies of work. So that's migration and politics and gender and politics. And I'll be drawing on data from the Indian context, which has over 100 million internal economic migrants, and about 75% of them are men. And particularly, I'll be using data from original fieldwork, qualitative interviews, and data from two primary surveys that I conducted, and also using data from a national level observational data set, a panel data set. And I'll present three key findings to you all today before concluding. I don't know if I'm going to go on my broader research agenda, it's just my practice job talk. Okay. So there's a lot of existing research on the politics of migrant sending communities, right? And a lot of it is focused on international or transnational migration. And some of this scholarship even tends to suggest that, migration can depress collective action among those who are left behind. And there's, as I said before, internal migration is more pervasive than international migration. And there has been scholarship looking at internal migration and the politics of internal migration. But a lot of it is focused on the migrants themselves or the receiving regions of these migrants. So in general, scholarship in migration and politics is lacking a gendered lens to that study. Which is where this project fits in. And it's also kind of important to consider this gender lens, because migration at the end of the day is a gendered phenomenon. Mostly men are undertaking it, and they're leaving behind their wives and families, and we know very little about the political lives of these women. And also because male migration creates the large-scale temporary absence of men from women's lives, right? Because men are moving for employment reasons. And we know from previous work on large-scale absence of men, which is permanent or indefinite absence of men because of huge events like war, civil conflict, genocide. We know that that has resulted in women gaining political empowerment, particularly political representation. And in that scholarship and in those accounts, we've seen that it has often occurred in the sense that women's political empowerment has been preceded by them achieving economic empowerment or economic autonomy as they step into like economic leadership positions in the absence of their husbands, right? And given the scholarship, we might think that something like male migration induced male absence is not as disruptive, right? Because migrants return home periodically, they're in touch with their wives and families, and most importantly, the traditional division of labor is retail. Basically, that men move for employment opportunities, so they still remain the primary breadwinners of the family. So women are reliant on the household, right? And which is where it differs from other forms of male absence, which I told you, where women kind of occupy economic leadership positions. And today, I'm going to argue that despite these constraints, male migration can significantly empower women along key political engagement measures. And I'm going to do that by drawing on the relationship between, drawing attention to household members and household structures and how that can affect political engagement. So, the household in itself has been identified by scholars of gender and politics as key to determining an individual's political engagement, right? So that's determined. And there's a huge scholarship looking at how male household members gatekeep women's presence beyond the household. Gatekeep as in they restrict women's presence beyond the household in order to uphold gender bias norms usually, right? And what the scholarship has not done so far of gender and politics is actually understand the relationship between gatekeeping norms, household structures, and household members, and how that affects female political engagement. And I am going to kind of suggest that I do that by looking at this case of male migration, which I suggest is a disruption to gatekeeping norms, because most importantly, it removes men from the household, right? So it's kind of altering the household structure and changing the relationship between the private and the public sphere, right? By removing a woman's husband, who's also her key gatekeeper, who restricts her access to the public sphere. And this, I argue, is leading to the feminization of everyday political engagement in migrant sending community. And the underlying mechanism, I argue, is that when men leave, women are basically thrust into the public sphere, right? So firstly, women are going to see an increase in mobility, and they're going to see increase in local knowledge, as I showed you in that quote. They're going to see greater access or contact with different actors that are not the household, even if it's just their friends. And it's also going to give them access to petty cash, and they also, learn certain skills, all of which, enable them to engage with the state. And most importantly, I'm going to say that women's political engagement or empowerment because of migration through this particular channel that I call the social exposure channel occurs even in the absence of women having earning autonomy, right? So women are not necessarily economically empowered before being politically empowered, which we've seen in other forms of male absence. So I want to talk a little bit about the context and data that I'll be using before going into the results. So as I said before, this project is set within the context of India, which has over 100 million internal migrants, and it's also highly patriarchal in nature. And a lot of my fieldwork was conducted in this eastern state of Bihar. It's also, it's along like this high migration corridor in India. And predominantly, a lot of my fieldwork was conducted in the district within Bihar, that is Araria, where I spent about 6 months of did about in-person, 6 months of in-person fieldwork, talking to a lot of stakeholders, women, resident women, men, elites as in political elites, to try to get like a holistic idea of what's happening. And I also ran 2 surveys, which meant recruiting and managing teams of surveyors. So what did all of this yield? So I'm going to be using, like in this project, I use data from about 100 qualitative interviews. In addition to that, I use data from a survey experiment, which basically helps me determine that there are restrictions within the household just from the presence of household members that restrict women's access to the public sphere. I also use data from another original survey of 1900 women that I primarily kind of use to validate a national level analysis and also provide very detailed kind of results on women's political participation across like a range of measures. And I also conducted a phone survey of elected representatives. And finally, I'm also going to use data from a national level panel data set to provide difference estimates on how male migration can affect different domains of women's lives. So the first result that I'm going to be talking about here is that I'm going to show you evidence using the survey experiment that male gatekeepers within the household restrict women's access to the public sphere, right? So the restriction to women's access to the public sphere often comes from within the household. So this is another quote from one of my respondents whom I was talking to in her bedroom. And at the time, she said, "Do you see the doorstep?" Right? So she points at the doorstep of the house and she said, "Do you see that doorstep? I usually do not cross that line when my husband is here." And her husband is a teacher in a village, right? So it's in his presence. She often does not have to or doesn't. I mean, it's internalized. We can like talk more about that, but she doesn't like often cross that line and step beyond the household, right? And just to give you a sense of gatekeeping and how that works. So the role of gatekeeping usually is to uphold gender biased norms, and male household members take on the role of gatekeepers who restrict women's access to the public sphere, right? And just given the nature of family structures and the dominance of multi-generational families, within a household, a woman can have not just one gatekeeper, but multiple. So it can be her husband, her in-laws, her teenage son. So I conducted this survey experiment to firstly understand what women themselves think of gatekeeping norms and how these norms might be affecting their political participation, right? So in this experiment, what I did was I gave women, I presented them with 2 out of these 4 tasks or political activities or participation. And this was kind of drawn from what my respondents told me, right, about what they were doing. So it includes like making a voter card at a school near your village so that you can vote in an election. Then the next one is engaging with local leaders and community members, mostly male members, in order to solve a land-related dispute that the household is engaged in. And the third one was traveling to a district town or a court, in a court, to a court, in order to deal with a theft that had happened in the house. There was a case that was pending in the court. And contacting an elected representative to get a signature on a form so that you can access some kind of welfare benefit, right? And the treatment here in this vignette experiment was to randomly vary the presence of each of the male gatekeepers, which is the woman's husband, the in-laws, and the teenage son, right? So I randomly varied the presence of each of them. And this was like a typical vignette that was read out to a respondent, right? So this was a statement that was read out, and whatever is bolded is the stuff that varies or can take different attributes. So it says, "I'm going to tell you about a woman in your ward," right? So the respondents here, I just want to clarify, are It's a sample of 643 women in this migrant sending region. So I'm talking to women respondents, and the surveyors are asking them this particular question. Okay, so they're telling them, I mean, they're first reading this, short paragraph, and they're saying, I'm going to tell you about a woman in your ward, which is in your village, and she has a migrant husband, okay, and her son is 16 years old. Her parents-in-law live with her, and she has a younger sister-in-law who also lives with her. And then they said to imagine that she has just finished her morning chores, cooking, cleaning, self-care, and other like unpaid labor that she does, and she has a few free hours in the afternoon. And then they read this particular political engagement activity. So it says the household is having a property dispute, and someone from the family has to attend the meeting that is being held in the village to solve this dispute, right? So this is what is read. And after this, we asked them this question, which was, how will you rank each of these following people based on their likelihood of doing this particular activity, right? And the options were the woman I just told you about, her son, other family members, and an acquaintance, right? So I want to state that the way this was set up was that there was always someone other than the woman in that vignette, right? Present at home who could do that particular task. And there was always the opportunity to pick an acquaintance among all of these options in the sense of like ranking them number one. So as I said, I varied the presence of the husband, the in-laws, and the son, right? So the husband's presence was varied in that he could either have been a migrant husband in the paragraph that was read to them, or a husband with a business in the village, so he lived, like he was a co-resident husband, and the son could have either been 8 years old or 16 years old, and the parents-in-law could have either died, right, so they're no more, or they lived with that woman that we were talking about, right? And I want to talk about two results here, okay? So let me try to explain this as easily as I can. So here what you see is the likelihood, the likelihood that this woman is ranked number one in doing a particular task, right? So she is picked to do this task, right? So you have this first estimate, which is on my right, so it's your left. And that's the condition where the husband is present at home, right? So the husband has a business in the village and he's present at home. And the likelihood of this woman being, picked to do this task is about 21%. And then you have this other condition where the husband is absent, right? So the husband is removed from the picture. And what you see is that the likelihood of this woman doing this particular task increases by 32 percentage points. So basically, the husband's presence in itself is restrictive. And once he's removed from the picture, you see that likelihood increases, right? So this kind of suggests what happens in the presence and in the absence of her husband. Now one might wonder, like, okay, but in many households there are other gatekeepers present, right? So there are like in-laws present. So what happens in that case? So let's assume, so here you have the most common form of household where it's multi-generational, you have in-laws, you have an teenage son. So that's the most restrictive condition, right? So the husband is present, the in-laws are present, teenage son is present. And so the likelihood there of this woman being picked is about 20%. So that's the typical joint family system you have. And then you have this estimate where the husband is removed from the picture, right? So he becomes a migrant and he's removed from the picture, but the others are present. That's the in-laws and the son. But just on having this husband, being removed from the picture, you see that the increase is by about 16 percentage points. And this is like statistically like significant, this difference, which suggests that even in joint family systems where other gatekeepers are present, the absence of the husband in itself can be important in easing restrictions and enabling women to access the public sphere. Now, we might wonder, what happens when you have this joint family system where everybody's present, but maybe the in-laws have died and the son is young. So the husband is still in the picture, right? So what I see is that in that case, there's easing of restrictions to some degree, but it's not statistically significant, and the extent of the increase or the easing is much smaller than in the husband's absence. So all of this basically just goes to say that all gatekeepers restrict women's access to the public sphere, but some gatekeepers are more important than others, and that somebody is the husband. So with this particular survey experiment, I have established that there are certain restrictions that exist within the household, just through the presence of certain household members, that restricts women's access to the political sphere, right? So that's the constraint that women are up against. And now what I'm going to present is that there's this huge phenomenon called male migration, which is actually removing one of these constraints, that's a woman's husband. And I'm suggesting that it's leading to women's political empowerment. And I'm calling this to be like the feminization of everyday political participation. So what does this, feminization look like, right? So I'm kind of defining it as this heightened presence of women in male-dominated, traditionally male-dominated political arenas. So what you have, on screen are pictures from government offices where I've seen women trying to access and engage with the state, right? And as you see, like some of, in this picture, like this woman is trying to get into a queue full of men. So that's what I'm saying. Like these are traditionally male-dominated spaces, and then you have women coming and occupying them, right? And I measure it in a couple of ways. So one is contact with state actors for welfare and public goods, right? So contact with state actors as in, people you bring to power, or street level bureaucrats, right? And here you have a quote from an elected representative himself, who's telling me, women are everywhere. So he's noting this, right? And this is in a migrant selling community, and he's saying women are everywhere. If there's a new fund or any kind of new welfare service, they'll come and ask us about it, right? So he's noting that women come and demand for welfare benefits and for like better public goods. And the first quote, remember, that I showed you about that woman asking for better roads. So that's her asking for like good, like public goods, right? Then there is political discussion, which is discussion within the household, because oftentimes it's assumed that women just listen to men, or they just follow what the household says. And I mean, all of us rely on other people to make political decisions, but it's often assumed that women just listen to what is being told to them. But here you have a woman telling me that she contributes to this discussion even. So in my family, this is a woman telling me, she says, in my family, we make voting decisions together. If we are here as in if women are the ones who are here, we obviously will know what's happening, like who is helping them, which elected representative is going to help them, right? So all of these things are usually, they're saying that women are the ones who would know this. And there's contact with state institutions, which is like literally like physically going to these different institutions. And I want to say that, this form of contact is just like it defines, like the state is very pervasive in these contexts. The state as in the government and who provides services. And a lot of these people are poor, so they rely on the state for a lot of their welfare services and public goods. And that's why engaging with these, state actors and institutions just defines the lives of a lot of the marginalized and poor in these contexts, which is why it's important. And so here you have a woman who says that, I've been to so many places. She's trying to get an identity card for her son name. And she says, I've been to multiple places, and I went to the district headquarters first. It did not help. I went to a nearby town where it did not get done. And I went all the way to, a further away town to figure this out. So here you have one woman going from one place to the other. And this is a context where women do not even do grocery shopping, right? So this is a woman attending, assembly meetings, participating in women's groups, and attending women's groups meetings. So I look at a range of measures, particularly with respect to this form of everyday political engagement with the state. And the first, I collected like obviously qualitative evidence, which tells me these are the types of engagement that people do. I also now next, try to quantify it using a national level panel data set, right, which is nationally representative two-wave panel. And it's called the Indian Human Development Study. And in that study, you have a women's module, right? So they ask questions to every woman in the household. So one woman in every household, that's in the sample. And they also, the survey also collects data on the migration status of every household member, right? So what I basically do is I merge these two data sets from this survey. So I effectively have each woman identified to her husband and his migration status, right? So I'm able to say whether in each wave of the survey, so this is two waves, whether her husband was migrant at the time of the survey or not, right? So the treatment in this case is the migration status of a woman's husband in the second wave. I think this will make it clearer. So what I do is I begin with this pool of 23,956 women, right? So you have this pool of 23,956 women whose husbands at the time of the first wave resided with them, right? So they were at home, they were not migrants. And then what I do is I follow these women to the second wave. And about 828 of them have husbands who are migrants only at the time of the second wave. That is, at the time of the second wave, they were migrants, right? And the remaining, which is 23,128 women, their husbands resided with them even at the time of the second wave, right? So basically, these 828 women become my treatment group, and then you have the remaining who are the control group. And with this, I set up very simple two-period difference in difference design, right? And I try to find out what is the effect of migration, male migration, on a range of on a range of empowerment measures, including some on political participation. And obviously, like migration is endogenous in some ways, and it's not random. So I do a bunch of tests to kind of deal with that. So what do I find? So I use this index. I constructed 4 indices, but here I'm showing you results from one index, which is related to political participation, right? So I created this index, which basically measured political discussion within the household and some kind of service access, right? So that's what's there in the survey. And what I want to kind of basically say over here is that according to these, this analysis, male migration or having a husband who's a migrant at the time of the second wave leads to an increase in this political participation index by about 6 to 10%. 6 to 10% because it's a binary. So it basically says that, and these are kind of, they're also fairly significant. So it says that, yes, at the macro level, just looking at what we have, there is evidence to suggest that male migration can be affecting women's political participation. But this obviously the national level analysis has its merits, and it gives us a very comprehensive idea of what migration can be doing. But at the same time, in order to supplement this analysis, I did my own survey, which was conducted in the state of Bihar that I showed you in the map. Where I surveyed about 1,900 women to get really a good sense of, and the survey really helped me understand different migration experiences or capture different migration types, which are usually like not present in a lot of national level data sets. And I also got a lot of, evidence from a range of political participation measures, which really define the kind of acts of participation that many women do in these contexts. And overall, I mean, these results that I have from my survey kind of corroborate the national level analysis, and they provide like more flavor to what I'm saying. So just one preview of what I find is, here you have the likelihood of a woman contacting an elected representative or just the state, different state actors for public goods, which is roads, sewage, electricity, street lights. And you see that women with migrant husbands are 5% more likely to contact elected representatives for public goods. And they're also 5% more likely to contact elected representatives for welfare entitlements, right? So this can be like cooking gas cylinders, it can be like things that you are kind of entitled to, or like food grain subsidies. You see that women with migrant husbands are more likely to contact the state, right? So all of this, just kind of adds to what I was trying to say with the national level analysis. And I do, analysis with a range of other measures as well. But all of it suggests that there is something about male migration that is empowering women along key indicators of participation. So far, I've shown you that there are restrictions that exist within the household, and a lot of those restrictions come from the presence of certain household members, particularly like a woman's husband. And then you have migration, which removes one of these restrictions, which is the husband, and that is enabling women to access the public sphere and the political sphere. And now I'm going to provide you evidence on how that could be happening, right? Like what's the underlying mechanism that's at play. And this is a quote from one of my respondents. So he basically says, the point here is that women are stepping into the public sphere, right? So they're stepping into roles previously reserved for men. And here you have an elite who's saying, in their husband's absence, women become the husband of the family, right? So women are stepping into these roles, and they're the ones doing a lot of like stuff outside the household, including the political sphere. And basically, in the project, I provide evidence that firstly, it's opening up what I'm calling a social exposure channel that is thrusting women into the public sphere, and they're stepping into roles previously reserved for men, right? And automatically, that's obviously going to, result in an increase in mobility for women as they're accessing the public sphere. And they're also getting an increase in, cash, usually from remittances from their husbands. And I'm also kind of, using my own survey to show that it has implications, like this form of, social exposure has implications for women's political engagement, particularly as it increases their contact with individuals beyond the household. So there's a lot of like work talking about how women in the Indian context and many patriarchal contexts have their network sizes are very small, which is why, for many of these women to talk to a lot of their friends on a regular basis involves or is in itself important and crucial. And also they learn local information and skills. If you remember the quote that I showed you right at the top, which was this woman going to doing grocery shopping and then finding out about a road. And that information she's using to contact her elected representative, right? So access to a lot of this information, which is important for them to engage with the state. And I'm just going to show you evidence on the last point, which is learning local information. So while I was, doing fieldwork, I was like, I want to find out, I want to kind of come up with a way to find out that these women have data information, right? So one can just go and ask them about something, but that would be like a self-reported measure, which can have biases in its own. So I decided to kind of rely on a factual question where women were asked to list down the documents that are required in order to access a certain welfare benefit. Okay, so instead of just going and asking them, oh, are you more informed or something, just like self-reported, you might be tempted to say yes, even though you're not, right? So I therefore ask them a factual question, and surveyors just have to kind of tick or check box whatever the respondent said, whatever she identified. And what I find is that women with migrant husbands are more likely to say that you need something like a photograph to for this particular application that you have to make, and you need another identity card, which we call an Aadhaar card. So they're more likely to kind of identify the need for certain documents. And very interestingly, there is like no relationship between identifying the need for a phone number, whether or not you have a migrant husband or not, because it kind of turned out that many brokers were asking for it. So it just like a lot of women were able to identify the need for a phone number. So with this, I basically kind of suggested, I've shown you evidence that with male migration, you have certain information that you get access to that you can use to go and contact the state. And finally, I want to kind of add that I don't find evidence that there's something happening like economically, right? So one of the things that I find is that women remain financially dependent on the household. So I find that they see an increase in their own farm work, but I don't see any evidence of increase in wage labor, right? And finally, I also don't see evidence that the household is seeing some kind of resource boom because of male migration. That could perhaps be explaining what we're seeing. So the economic channel really is kind of muted when we think about male migration and how that could be affecting women's political lives or just empowerment. So in order to, so just to conclude, with this project, I've kind of, identified that one of the most significant barriers to women's political engagement comes from within the household and particularly their household members. And male migration forms a kind of temporary absence from the household, which is, I'm arguing shifting how local political engagement is being conducted in a lot of these patriarchal migrant-selling communities. And unlike other forms of male absence, women are likely to be politically empowered despite being reliant on the household financially. And this project really contributes to the scholarship on migrants in the communities by bringing in a gender lens to understand the politics in each context and saying that it can add more nuance to how much we know about these communities, and finally also revisiting the role of the household, particularly household members, and how that shapes an individual's political empowerment. With that, I want to conclude, and thanks everyone for your attention. And yeah, I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you have.
Hi, thank you, first of all. My question, well, I don't really know if it's a question, but so you're seeing like 6 to 10% increase in participation. That's not a huge number. So how are people responding to your research with that sort of not great increase?
Okay. You said you have 2 questions, or okay. Maybe I can go question.
Yeah, let's do a couple.
Okay.
Oh, so all questions?
Yeah, just pass.
I had a question, just can I?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, go ahead.
Since I'm in the middle here, but so you mentioned that the fact that the men migrate does not mean that the women become financially independent. Does that mean that they keep sending money to them so that they can live even though they're gone for an indeterminate amount of time? Like, what would that mean, like, specifically? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rithika. That was fascinating. At some point, I want to know why Araria district is such a favorite amongst political scientists. I feel like I've sort of read about the research of many political scientists on that district. So I had 2 questions. One is, does this evidence of women's empowerment decrease as household incomes increase at all to a certain point where, for example, out migration is not necessary by the male member or the sort of husband. So is there a point at which this finding stops applying? At which point you start seeing women's empowerment sort of stagnating? Or is it that at that point, when there are increased household incomes, that other things like access to women's education, etc., might kick in? So I just wondered if you had a hypothesis or if you studied that. The other is, how do women experience, or how do they talk to you in their responses to you about what you describe as political empowerment? I assume that they don't describe it in those terms. So what are the terms in which they would describe what is it? I mean, is it seem like in the way they describe it that this is now an additional responsibility that they have to take care of, in addition to all the other unpaid responsibilities they have? Or is there a recognition to them that in their life they are the empowerment in the way you put it is a good thing, and that they see it as a good thing as well? Thank you.
Maybe I can do these.
Yeah.
And then we'll go around.
Okay.
So your question was, is a 6 to 10% increase like significant or not? Yeah, it is pretty significant given the magnitude of what we're seeing, and also given that we're starting from a position where, you know, that woman is telling me she doesn't even step out of her immediate household or whatever, and even in terms of, if, you know, we've also seen that in many migrant communities, women vote at larger numbers, where even the increase is by maybe 2 to 3 or 4%, and that's huge, like given just the sheer magnitude of it. And I mean, I don't want to say that, but like statistically also, I find that it's significant. So yeah, these are significant results. And I don't know, I've not presented my results to my respondents, so I don't know how they would perceive it, just in that sense. But do I think that this is it? No, there's still a lot more to you know, for women to achieve, and there are certain variables or outcomes where I don't see positive, you know, effects. So there's a lot more to be achieved, and some of it also goes back to what. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Nikhil. Yeah, Nikhil's question on how women are perceiving it, and maybe, you know, I'll answer that when I answer his question. But yeah, I think that the effect sizes are fairly significant. Then there's the question on, okay, so are men sending money, right? So what are they doing with their pay? Yes, often, yes, men send money. So women are kind of mostly reliant on remittances that are being sent to run the household. And some of them can supplement this. They do, like, they rear cattle, or they have, like, you know, shops outside their house, or they like do some tailoring. But yes, a lot of it is remittance reliant. And I've spoken to a lot of women who say that they want to work, but there's no work. I mean, even the men cannot find jobs, so it's even hard. Like, women are not going to find jobs themselves. So yeah, so they are kind of reliant on. So Nikhil, to your point on, okay, so the first point was, is there evidence on when incomes increase, like kind of what happens, right? I mean, I don't know if there's a certain cutoff point where, you know, this I can say something, just identify a certain point, but I think some of the evidence that I've shown, when I look at non-migrant households, they are richer, right? So you could think of them in the question that you're asking. So they are people with, many of them have about 25% own land, so they are like landowning elites. So in those households, yes, women do not generally tend to like engage with the state. It's often others within the household, and we know that many of them are also. So that many of them tend to be upper caste, where often there are like greater restrictions on women's mobility beyond you know, the household. So yes, it's I would assume that, you know, in these contexts, given my control, not comparison, usually is upper caste, where women have greater restrictions. And how do women experience it, right? Like, what they think about this, and so it's one of the, you know, it's one of the things that I thought about as well. So some of the results that I've shown you here is things like going and asking for, you know, a ration card, or like like cooking gas cylinder or something like that. And yes, that's a pretty big. But there's also something like going and asking for better roles, like you're doing that out of, your own volition. You're the one going outside, doing grocery shopping. So you want better roles, so you're going and doing that yourself. And then I also have evidence, I have evidence where I also find that women are more likely to participate in women's groups and also attend women's groups meeting. But to your specific point on how women are seeing it, I also have evidence on that. Maybe she can just go and do it. Okay. Okay, so what you see here is when I asked women why they picked a woman in the experiment to do a task, many of them say that it's because nobody else is there to do it. So in their head, they believe that they are doing something because it's out of necessity, which is why I also say that while women are occupying this public sphere, there's still a lot more to achieve in terms of empowerment because it's not changing how they're thinking about their own efficacy. So, yeah, that would be my. Maybe I should just stand here. Yeah, it might be easier to access the appendix. Yeah.
Question. Here we go.
So I was wondering if you've done any research or observed anything about when the husbands come back to the house, and when I was wondering if you see these women like pull back completely on this political engagement or if it continues.
Yes. Right. So maybe I can answer that. Yeah. So yes, I do have some evidence on what happens when having some trouble reading it.
Which one are you looking for?
It's return.
3 up.
Okay, then.
The short one.
There you go. Anyway, so what I do find is that when their husbands return home, I mean, this is just a definitive estimate, but I can just talk you through it, right? So what I do find is that mechanically there's a decrease in that women are less likely to access the public sphere, so their mobility decreases, and you see a decrease in their access to cash, which is more mechanical. But very interestingly, I find like a null effect in the sense that women in their husband's absence are not doing any worse off with respect to participating in decision making within the household, right? So they're still making decisions with respect to like fertility or like spending and things like that, which is important, right, in these contexts because it means that they have greater bargaining power and that seems to sustain even after husbands return home. And I similarly see that for political discussion. So to your point, just to answer, it's nuanced. But it seems to stick in key indicators of bargaining power within the household and also goes to a lot of conversations with migrants who themselves say that they value what women have brought in and what they, kind of learn in their absence and rely on it. So yes, there is like some kind of persistence and it's a good thing. Yeah.
So thank you. My question might not be directly applicable to the region that you studied in India or maybe India itself, but I was wondering in greater conflict regions or subsequent greater migration zones, would there, through this increase in women's involvement in the public sphere, would that in any way affect the education of children at home? So with women beginning to step into roles or even breadwinning roles, which be out of the house more, and a lot of these regions, children are still being educated at home or at least learning high valuable skills at home. So would this negatively affect that in any way?
Right. Yeah,
why not?
Okay, so I can tell you what I see in this context. I do find that a lot of, in a sense, I don't find evidence myself, but I have seen that when someone has a migrant in the household, they actually tend to invest a lot in their children's education. So these households, their children they put them in private school instead of government school. So they value this education and use a lot of the remittances in improving their child's education. And this is scholarship that a lot of people in economics have also established that the learning outcomes of kids in migrant households tend to increase. So to your point was also about what's happening in conflict contexts. Isn't that what you were asking?
Sure, yeah.
If that would be the case. Yeah, perhaps because women are gaining leadership positions and we know that women value things like education and health, particularly for their kids. So while I cannot concretely say that, but I would assume that it does affect learning outcomes. But I mean, these are also conflict contexts, so I don't know how much of it is actually affecting schooling in general and the state and all of that. So it would really be contingent on that too. Yeah.
I kind of have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, so how well are women actually perceived by local governments, and like, is that really male dominated, especially like patriarchal, like you mentioned? So are women actually, like, is their opinion actually taken into consideration? Are they valued? Is there like a positive change in the number of female political leaders in smaller villages in India? And then the second one is, you kind of answered this, but like, in when the pandemic happened, there was like this reverse migration from urban cities to local villages again. So was there like a difference in the way women were perceived politically? And like during the pandemic, was there like less participation at all?
Participation of who?
Of women in like political sphere.
So how do elites or elected representatives perceive women? I think it's positively. Sometimes it can border on them being irritated with them because many of them say that they sometimes are exasperated with how much women come and pester them. But one of the things they do kind of recognize is the importance of women in elections, and that's something that I'm actually going to look at like going forward on how this is affecting electoral politics and attitudes. And I have some, I did like this quick phone survey of political elites, and basically they find women to be more discerning, like voters and citizens, them to be more likely to vote for development, less likely to be swayed by money before elections than men, like in comparison to men. So yeah, it seems to be changing, and particularly I think among elected representatives, because they recognize that women are important for them to win elections, and they do make it easier for women to access the state to some extent. But very interestingly, at least street level, like bureaucrats that you encounter in government institutions, I showed you images. I heard that many bureaucrats tend to, they're very annoyed at women in the sense that they in fact, like, make it worse for them to engage with the state. They like push them away, or they're like, go here, go there, like they like send them from one place to the other. So it's interesting, maybe something to even like study if there are different reactions based on who this elite is or who they're interacting with. To the second point on so is there an increase in female leaders? Isn't that what you asked? If
Kind of like during the pandemic, like after people moved back.
Yeah. No, your second question was something about leadership, female leaders.
Oh, that was like part of the first question. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so let's just I mean, what I do find, I can just tell you what I found with respect to female leaders is at least I found that women with migrant husbands are more likely to actually contact their leaders if that particular village is reserved for women. So we don't know if it's the female leaders who make it easy or their husbands, but there's something like going on there. I mean, I don't know, like I didn't do too much pre-pandemic work, so I don't know like what happened post-pandemic, so I cannot conclusively say, but I do know, and I have some data on that, is that a lot of men return back to work. So this was September, October, people were back like 2020 because it's just they're so important to the economy and to what they do, and also they just don't have any other alternatives. So many of them like just went back to work. So I don't know how much of a decline was observed, but that could be interesting. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I had a question about sort of where you see women's role in leadership in India going forward. So do you think maybe in maybe 10, 20, 30 years that where do you see sort of the patriarchal structures? Do you think women will have a bigger role despite whether or not men are there? Like, do you think that the momentum will kind of build going forward?
That's a huge question. I mean, at least what we can observe is that over time, we've seen a positive momentum. Even if right now I put up the figure of the national level parliament and how many women are there. definitely low, but that's like world over where women don't really occupy such senior leadership positions. But at least in the Indian context, we have things like gender quotas that have tried to kind of bring more women into the fore. So the hope is that they've existed at the local level, and some say there are positive effects, but I mean, my own finding is that it might not be as effective, but they're now being also, it's most likely going to be that in the next election, we'll have women, reserved seats, even at the national and the state level. So it could be that, if effectively there are such policies put in place that try to, get around the fact that we have a context that's highly patriarchal, then yes, it can bode well. And also some work even suggests, and this is something I've observed myself, that in places where you've had a woman, like when she runs again, like it's her second term, she's definitely more empowered. Even if she came to like power through a quota seat, like through a seat that was reserved for women only, just being in office once increases, just something about that happens, just exposure and experience. So hopefully we're like in the right direction. I don't know how fast that's going to happen, but yeah.
So my question kind of had to do with children. I know you talked a little
Yeah.
bit about how like teenage sons acted as gatekeepers, but I was just wondering how like if the woman had children, like male or female, otherwise, how that influenced kind of their mobility and how that was reflected in any of the research that you did.
I mean, I don't look at it specifically about like whether having kids, I control for it, like how many kids you have. But I would actually think that, yes, I mean, having kids can be, it can be hard in that, especially having young kids, because a lot of that labor and care work is, falls on women. So it definitely would, depress her ability to access and do like political tasks. And but that also goes to just how a lot of this burden of unpaid like care work and labor is falling on women, and it also depends, like a lot of women, especially when they have younger kids, they anyway do not go out too much, and those people I don't even like survey, because my survey starts from women aged 25 to 40, because I wanted to there's a completely other dynamic when you deal with women who are 18 to 24. But yeah, I mean, I do think it will just, in general, norms are such that it just is hard for them to access. Yeah.
Hi, I have two questions. Like, first question is about the economics of migration as a whole. I was wondering, like, when we're talking about like economics of migration, do we usually talking about it in then like international level, like migrate from like this country to another country, or like are we doing it in a more like internal, like domestic area, like basically a demographic change within the country? And the second question is more about like research design. So like so basically you using like difference in difference method to like build up the model. So I was wondering like when you get that parameter from the interaction term, like you basically got the results. So I was wondering like what is the next step after you got the results, saying that probably there will be a change in political engagement, and then what should you go about the result? Like how do you choose to like do more like set up more variables, etc.
Okay, so your first question was, are we looking at internal or international migration, right? We're looking at internal migration, so it's migration that's occurring within India, like in this context, but broadly, yeah, within a nation, like a border, or can even be within a region, right? So that's what we're looking at, and specifically economic migration, like you said, people moving for employment opportunities, which happen to be mostly men in these contexts. So your second point was, what do I do with the results that I find, like in the sense of like I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that. Like, what am I going to do with this? Take it to home, or like is that what you mean? How am I going to disseminate it? Is that your question?
Yeah, so basically I was thinking, because if I do it, I will basically set up the person model, and then I test the result to see whether it's like effective or statistically significant.
Right.
So, but I figure that you do a lot of things other than that, like for test for like mobility and all that also. So I was wondering, how do you know to get to those variables? Do you like do more qualitative research, or do you do more interviews to know these are the things you want to test?
Right. Okay. So So a lot of this analysis, the way I feel I do my research is I tend to do qualitative research before, right? Like, so I presented some interviews that I did. So that's primarily my qualitative work. So upon talking to a lot of women, I realized that yes, these are different forms of political engagement, and there is a certain pathway to which it's being achieved, and some of that is with women, being more active. So when I started talking to people, this was way back in 2020, one of the first things that I started with elite interviews. So one of the first things that everybody told me about migrant women was that they become active. That's the word that they use, that women are active. So which is why, the mobility variable, right? And the other thing is, which is here, which is decision making, is and a lot, it's not just me, a lot of scholarship on gender in general, has said that when you want to talk about women's empowerment, you have to look at their bargaining power within the household. Right, so that's a very key indicator of empowerment that many economists have defined way before me. Right, so I'm just following their and I'm also kind of looking at it because I realized when I started doing my research that the household is very key to my story. So I wanted to also look at how the dynamics within the household change. So that's why I'm looking at a variable like decision making. So if something persists, even after men return, that's a very key form of empowerment that I'm finding. And then there was this social financial index, which was it was more like what's happening with respect to women's access to cash and also other forms of financial, the index also has property access, bank account access. So it's an index that I formed to understand what's happening to women's financial position within the household. So that's how I came about with that. So I started with these 4 indicators, but a lot of it was drawn from prior reading and also from qualitative interviews. And also what I was limited to given the data set I had, right? So one also needs to be cognizant. Yeah.
Hi, so you talked about demographics in terms of controlling your the women that you surveyed. In terms of that, did religion ever play a factor, or did that come up at all in terms of political participation? I don't know if you have.
Yes, I do collect data on the dominant religions there, which is Hindu and whether you're Hindu or Muslim. I think I don't know if I have the fact here, but yeah. So if you are Muslim, you tend to be less likely, to engage in faith making or civic engagement. So it looks like women who are Hindus and migrant husbands, they're more likely to perhaps engage in politics. Yeah, that could be. It's not significant, but it's fine. Yeah, it tends to be it's going downward. Yeah, it's negative.
And I would just let anybody who has questions that you might want to ask individually to stick around for a few seconds. For everybody else, here we go.